Hello and welcome to today's lecture. Today we will be going over writing the infrastructure audit report. The objective for this section is to describe the parameters required to conduct and report on an IT infrastructure audit for organizational compliance. After you complete your audit, you did your audit already, the final report is the most important part of the process. So communicating with the organization that you're auditing is the most important part. If you've done all of your auditing and you've assessed risk levels and reviewed controls, when you have findings, when you have results, you need to be able to communicate those to the company that you're working for. So writing this final report is the most important part of your job. When you write your report, it's going to drive management to consider resources and appropriate steps to improve compliance. What that means is they're going to take your recommendations, and for the next cycle, they're going to include things in their budget to allocate resources into fixing these gaps in our controls. So the primary purpose of your audit report, the final report, is going to be communicating the results of what you did. It's also going to clear up any misunderstanding. So the report at the end should be very concise. And then it's going to also let them know what they can do as a follow-up to fix the problems that were identified in the audit. So the first thing we're going to do in this chapter is talk about the different components, what sections you should have in the executive summary of a report, and then the parts of the report. We're going to have a section to report about the controls and countermeasures, whether they're effective or they need to be replaced. We're going to talk about how to analyze gaps in IT security controls and give them that guidance on what they should do to fix their problems. And then your recommendations, what should be included in recommendations from the auditor. The final audit report is going to be pretty lengthy, probably, depending on the scope of your audit. It could be 10 pages or it could be 60 pages. But it's usually a lot of pages, a lot of information to digest. So what we're going to do is, as part of our report, we're going to have an executive summary. It's going to provide a brief overview to senior management and other decision makers and stakeholders, basically the details of what happened during the audit. A lot of times you'll find these executives won't read the report. They don't have time to sit and read a 60-page report. So this executive summary is going to be very, very important to communicate what was found during the audit. Another reason that you need an executive summary is that some of the other executives that are outside of the IT department, the IT realm, may not have the technical expertise to understand what's in the report. The executive summary is going to provide the necessary information for both types of executives. For the ones who don't have time to read, for the other ones who are not tech literate and need to be able to understand the results of your audit. Now, when you write this executive summary, you don't want it to be an introduction to your audit. Okay? When you think of an introduction, you think of the main idea, and then we're going to tell them basically the agenda, what we're going to cover, and then tell them how you're going to end the report. That's an introduction for a thesis. We don't really want it to be an introduction. The executive summary must be able to exist on its own. So if they don't want to see the details of the audit, they should be able to pick up the executive summary and know everything about the audit. It should be able to stand on its own. You shouldn't have to have references down in the audit if they don't want to look at them. Many executive summaries are standalone documents and may even have an accompanying presentation. So you might even make a separate package for your client that just has the executive summary and slides for that executive summary. And then if the technical people want to dig down into the details of your audit, they can look beyond the executive summary. Remember, the summary, executive summary should not be vague. It should include pertinent and valuable information. For example, you need to be specific in this executive summary. An example would be somebody would put in a summary, important baseline controls were missing. So you're telling them the important baseline controls were missing. In an executive summary, you want to be very precise and say, instead of baseline controls were missing, you could say over 24 instances of malicious code were found on the systems. And 65% of all systems did not have antivirus software installed or enabled. So that's an example of not being vague, being very specific about your findings. Remember, it's not necessary to highlight every issue. The executive summary should include or clearly outline the most important issues, right? The big ticket items. Your executive summary could be a single page or multiple pages. A good guideline is your executive summary's length should be 10% of the actual audit report. So, if the audit is 10 pages, your executive summary should be 1 page. That's 10% of 10 pages. If your audit is 60 pages, then your executive summary should be about 6 pages. Those are guidelines. They're not fast rules, but to get you to understand or to point you whether or not you're doing things correctly, that's usually the guideline that they use. The executive summary should have these sections in the executive summary, typically. Remember, we want to follow best practices. Your executive summary doesn't have to follow this structure, but most do. So if you do the same thing that what most other people do, then that's usually sufficient. Remember, all of these topics are going to be covered in detail in the final report. The final format of the report and executive summary vary by organization. When you make a good executive summary, it's going to effectively communicate the most important items of your audit, and it's going to lead to positive changes within the organization. And that's what you want. You want them to act on your audit findings. Another part of the report will be a summary of findings. An audit finding is a documented conclusion. So you may have multiple findings, and it's going to be a conclusion from the auditor. It's going to include deficiencies, it's going to include abuses, fraud, or other illegal acts. So audit findings are not good. The objective of the audit determines how findings need to be documented. So when you sit down and you have that meeting at the beginning of the audit that we talked about last week when we were planning the audit, That's going to communicate or be a guideline on how to document the audit findings. As findings are discovered, further investigation might be required to satisfy the objectives, which will be summarized in the final report. So you will put those objectives that you agreed upon in the planning stage into your audit report. And this is where the scope might increase, the size of the audit, depending on the findings. Remember, that was one of the things that we could do to hamper our auditor, is to make the scope too small. If they have a flexible scope, they can expand their audit when they find things to give them a complete picture of everything that's going on. There's always 4 elements of a finding. So when you put your finding in your audit report, you're going to have first the criteria. That's going to identify the desired state. So the criteria is what we want in a perfect world. This is the way we want the system to work. An example of a criteria might be based, for example, on regulations, policy, standards, and external frameworks. So typically we take a policy and we say, according to the company policy, this is how this should work. The circumstance of the finding identifies a situation within the IT environment that exists. So you give a picture of what's going on in the IT organization during when you found your finding. The cause part identifies the reason for the gap between the circumstance and the criteria. So the criteria is, like I said, in a perfect world, how the system should be set up. The circumstance is what it actually is in real life. And the cause tells the reader why there's a difference between the criteria and the circumstance. You're going to use the cause to as a jumping off point for which you can make recommendations to correct the situation. So when we identify the cause, then we can try to start figuring out ways to remedy the finding. The impact identifies the effect or potential impact on the IT department based on the difference between the circumstance and the desired states, or the circumstance and the criteria. You might also reveal several things that might already be occurring. So it could be, if you don't fix this now, this is what's going to happen. That's part of the impact statement. Or you can say it's already happening. So in order to provide this summary of findings in a meaningful yet concise way, we may have to have gap analysis. So a gap analysis is going to measure where the organization is and where it would like to be. In order for you to be able to give that analysis, you need to have a complete understanding of the systems across the entire IT department. So you have to have the big picture. And that was part of the planning that we talked about last week. In a few slides, we're going to talk about maturity modeling. So once we put one of these recommendations in place, we're going to monitor whether those recommendations were acted upon and how well they were acted upon. So there's different degrees of compliance, and we're going to talk about that when we start talking about maturity modeling. A complete security assessment should include details about risk as part of the report. Because that's what we're mainly concerned about, correct, is the risk. This is all risk-based risk management framework. So that's what we care about. Since we worried about risk, we want to include full documentation of the threats that were identified during the audit, the vulnerabilities, and the resulting risk. The components of the risk assessment should include the following. You should have an introduction that provides the purpose and scope of the assessment. So it's going to tell the reader what the scope and why the audit was performed. We're going to include all of the resources that we used during the audit, such as IT systems, personnel, locations, and other information about the environment. The approach section of your assessment is going to let the reader know what methods you used to assess the IT department. System characterization provides details about the infrastructure systems. So we're going to give them a picture of what the IT department looks like. So we could include a list of hardware, a list of software we use, the types of data we process, the interfaces on the pieces of equipment, the users that use the equipment. So it's everything about the actual IT equipment that we're auditing. We're going to have a threat statement. It's a complete outline of potential threat sources. So these are the threats that we're concerned about. The assessment results is going to provide details on vulnerabilities and threats, specifically talking about the vulnerabilities and the threats, and we're matching them. And then a summary. It's going to provide a concise review of observations as well as risk levels. You may have recommendations in the summary portion. The report should describe the next step to determine the impact that would result from a vulnerability being exploited. So, after we put all this together, we're going to actually talk about what impact we have from the vulnerability being acted upon. And we use some tools from the NIST 853 and some of the COVID maturity, the COVID framework. And here's one of the methods we're going to use to talk about risk analysis. So what we're typically going to do is we're going to make a matrix where we have the impact level on one axis, and then we're going to have the likelihood on the other axis. So the metrics we use for threats is how likely is a threat or a situation to occur. So you could say it's really likely, it might happen, or it's unlikely to happen. And then we're going to take the impact of it happening. How's it going to affect your business? How's it going to impact your operations? And then we're going to have a metric for that. So a low impact would be maybe a 10, a medium impact would be a 50, and a high impact would be 100. Remember, we're borrowing these from risk frameworks. So this risk matrix comes from, like I said, a NIST document. And then what we're going to do is multiply the metric from the impact level by the metric from the likelihood. And then we get this grid of how likely is something to happen and the impact of it happening. And then what we can do is we can even make a color system. So let's see if I can get the colors working. So this area over here would be like a green area. Low impact. Sorry. Let me erase that. Hang on. Get rid of highlight. So down here would be green, right? So we have low likelihood and low impact. Green things we don't have to worry about that much because it's very unlikely to happen, and even if it does happen, impact is low on our organization. At the other end of the spectrum is going to be our red items, where we have high impact and high likelihood. High impact, high likelihood. Those are the things that we need to take care of first. And then maybe in the middle, you might put another color, put yellow, so everybody understands stoplights. So instead of putting these scores and associating them with particular systems or hardware or processes, what we would do is color code those processes or systems. Because everybody knows they need to pay attention to the red things and not so much attention to the green things. So instead of putting a score of 25 for the threat matrix, we would put a yellow on the system. Right? So that's an example of how we use these frameworks to help us to communicate our audit findings. Right? And then, all right. So that's called the threat matrix. The other thing we might have is another tool we use is called a maturity model. What a maturity model does is it provides a framework for measuring process performance. It gives you areas we identify areas for improvement, and then we grade whether or not we're making progress. So we typically assign different levels to the maturity process. We're going to say whether a fix has been implemented. If it hasn't at all, then it's going to be given a maturity score of 0. Whereas if we put a process in place to meet compliance and it's a 5, that means we are putting the control into place, and we are checking it to make sure it is working. So not only do we have the control in place, we're monitoring it. So here's the example of a maturity model, or the results that we give them. The results of a compliance assessment should clearly address whether specific requirements are met. So when we look at the control objectives, we're going to give them a score of compliant, non-compliant, not determined, or not applicable. If we mark it as compliant, it's going to indicate there's enough suitable evidence to show that a particular requirement has been met. For a status of non-compliant, it's going to indicate that enough suitable evidence was collected to show that a particular requirement has not been met. So compliant and non-compliant is the same. We have the evidence, and this is our verdict. Not determined indicates that not enough evidence was collected to make the appropriate compliance determination. So we're going to say, yes, we tried to audit this, but because of the constraints on our audit, we couldn't determine whether or not the system was compliant or not. An example of one of these controls that we need to assess would be for PCI DSS, our processing standard for credit cards. An example of the requirement might be, do not use default vendor passwords. And then you're going to report your procedure and how you actually checked. So you can say, I tried to log into a sample of critical systems using vendor-supplied default passwords from product documentation. So the requirement was, these systems are not going to use default passwords. The procedure was, I tried to log into the systems with the default passwords. And then we're going to have a status of whether it's compliant, non-compliant, non-determined. And then you can put some comments there if you'd like in your audit report. So this is the order in which you should do things when you're doing your report. You're going to have the report on findings and gap analysis report results. We're going to identify and report on security controls implemented and risk. That's our risk matrix. We're going to report on the results of the compliance assessment. That's the statuses we just talked about, whether it was compliant, non-compliant, or not determined. We're going to present recommendations and action plans. So not only are we going to tell them this is compliant or not compliant, if it's not compliant, here's an action plan how to bring it into compliance. And then finally, when we have all of that information compiled, we're going to write the executive summary. So the executive summary should probably be the last thing that you write, because you're going to create a whole 60-page document of all of this information, and then we're going to draw a conclusion and write an executive summary of the 60 pages that we just wrote. So the executive summary comes first when you present it, but it comes last in the actual process of doing the audit. When you write recommendations, remember they should be specific, not general. They should bring the IT department in better alignment with the organizational governance. It should reduce risk. It should align with the business objectives. So your recommendations, you should understand the policies of the organization and the business objectives so that you can give them good advice. When we give these recommendations, we need to make sure that we hit these 5 areas to protect your customer. So remember, a gap analysis is comparing as is to the where we want to be. So you compare the present state of the controls with the desired state. And the difference between those two is called the gap. Gap analysis communicates those gaps that we have in our systems. When you're conducting your gap analysis, you should get legal counsel during the process of gap analysis regarding regulatory requirements. So if you're in a heavily regulated industry or organization is regulated by the federal government, you need to consult a lawyer. Legal requirements vary from state to state and across different countries. So the laws that you have in North Carolina might be different if you move to another state and do an audit there. Organizations that operate within a single country may still have to meet certain requirements based on the flow of information to other countries. So if your information passes to other countries, even though we're not based in that country, we need to obey those laws. We also need to analyze, has the organization identified all legal, regulatory, and industry-specific requirements. So these are the 5 big important ones. We need to make sure that our company is respecting intellectual property rights. That is, are we using processes from other countries? Are we not? Are we not in compliance with copyright laws? So that is IPR. Protecting and retaining organizational records. A lot of industries are regulated where you have to have records from a certain time period. So you may have to keep your records for 7 years. There is a retention law or retention policy. We need to make sure that we have that paper trail of those records and we're keeping them in an archive for the number of years that we legally have to. We have to make sure that we're compliant with all privacy laws. So that's protecting personal information. We need to make sure that we're preventing users from using systems for unauthorized purposes. There's a lot of legislation that provides protection against computer misuses. Organizations are required to meet requirements for security monitoring and access notification. So are we notifying people when their information is used in a way that is unauthorized? We have a lot of notification laws. And then make sure we're managing our crypto. What that means is if we start using our information in another country, example North Korea, Iran, they have very strict laws on what can be encrypted and what can't. So we don't want to get our company in legal trouble with one of these countries because we're using encryption in a country that is outlawed encryption. So in summary, what we've talked about is we hit all of the components of an executive summary. And then we talked about the summary of findings. That is all of the findings that occurred during the audit. We learned how to report on the implementation of controls and countermeasures. We talked about maturity models. We talked about risk matrices. We talked about how to analyze gaps in the controls and countermeasures. And we also learned what to include in the compliance recommendations, so the auditor's recommendations. That is the end of the lecture for this section. Thank you for joining me today. If you need this, there will be a recording of it on your course website. Have a great week.